afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to another event at the Danube Institute. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of it. And we are fortunate today in having two extremely distinguished professors of history and ideas, but more particularly than that, people who are able to debate and discuss these questions in a continually fresh and interesting way. Now, our speaker today is going to be Professor David Starkey, and he will come to the podium in a moment, after which I will then ask Professor Fonte to respond to his remarks, and then we will have a conversation for another half hour or so. So that's the format, and then we are very relaxed here. We would like to promote a dialogue back and forth, nothing too formal, and at the end of and then when we run out of things to say, we will adjourn and have a drink. So thank you. So once again, thank you for being here. Professor Starkey is a well-known figure in the modern world of politics and of communications, as well as in academic life. Yeah, he was a professor. He is a historian from Cambridge initially, having been born and brought up in the north of England, quite near where I was born and brought up in a similar time. And in fact, we have a conversation which covers many things, but including our origins, which is going to come out shortly in a podcast. But today, his work as a historian and as being led to a great interest in the Tudors, and he is at the moment working on a major biography of Henry VIII, but of course he has written a great deal else, and more to the point too, he has managed to become a famous figure, a television and radio historian who has brought these issues and these controversies from the past alive in an extraordinarily fresh and interesting way. So his topic today is somewhat different. It is the crisis that we are facing in today's world, the crisis of Western civilization on the one hand, a crisis also of the wokery, which is an attack on Western civilization, and provides the basis for an enormous clash. So I'm very interested myself to see how he is going to reimagine and re-anchor the Western values, which at the moment the Western values have become, so to speak, a set of ideas and a set of achievements which are very ashamed of themselves, even though they are remarkably valuable by any standard in today's world. So I am going to begin by asking Professor Starkey to address us, and following that, I will invite a response from Professor Fonte, who has just received a distinguished award from the Hungarian government, to follow on. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Professor Starkey.
John, well, rather the two Johns, it's a very great pleasure to be speaking and indeed debate is the wrong word, discussing with John Fontaine. And extraordinarily, the word opportunistic has got unfortunate connotations, perhaps better fortunate, which isn't intended as a parody or indeed a pun on his name. His book, of course, which was the background to the award, challenges the ideas of Francis Fukuyama and reasserts the values of the nation-state. And that's going to be one of the things that I shall be talking about. I'd like to begin with a wider picture. John talked about Western values. I'm not sure I understand what Western values are. I would like to talk about something else. I would like to talk about what I think is fundamentally the crisis of liberalism. That what we're seeing now is the collapse or the undermining or the disintegration of a particular approach and understanding of human society, of the relationship between the individual and the group, of states to each other, and so on, that we can put into a sort of very large envelope labeled liberalism. What has happened? I'm sure we're all familiar with Fukuyama's, well, first of all was the article, The End of History, and then I'm afraid, like many American books, it was really a slightly overblown version of the article, was it not? The article is effectively applying a notion that in 1989, history came to an end. And it came to an end essentially because the liberal state and liberalism of politics, liberalism of society, liberalism of everything had triumphed, and there was an absolute certain bond between a free market economics and a free society, and so on, and there was an inevitable triumph of all of this. Of course, 1989 is there because of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but I think to understand the full arc of what Fukuyama is talking about, we need actually to begin in 1945 and the attempted reconstruction of the world in the wake of the Second World War, and a reconstruction which was, of course, very aware of what they all thought had gone wrong, and this is a very appropriate place to talk about what had gone wrong in the wake of the settlement after the First World War. And what you have in 45 is a very conscious assertion of liberal universalism. A liberal universalism which purports to be a general account of human nature and based upon a general understanding of human nature. It is, of course, a doctrine which goes back to the Enlightenment itself, which in some respects actually goes back to the first Enlightenment, the real Enlightenment of late 17th century England, as opposed to the fancy dress of 18th century France. And it's a doctrine that bases itself, forgive me, I've irritated thought. It's a doctrine that bases itself on things that we are, of course, completely familiar with. But let me put it slightly differently. I think the essential thing to understand about liberalism is that it is a doctrine that rests on the notion of human similarity, that fundamentally all human beings are the same, that underneath the superficiality of national difference, under the superficiality of race, of class, of everything else, we are fundamentally the same. Difference is accidental, similarity is substantial. And everything that we see being constructed in 45 and as it were reasserted in 1989 is based on that simple principle. The idea of particularly of the International Declaration of Human Rights, heavily sponsored, of course, and seen through by Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, if one looks at all of those things that developed from that, ideas of liberal democracy, the ideas of the rule-based international system, of the idea of globalization itself, we can see all of them, as it were, presented by Fukuyama in this idealized form as what are any of you familiar with the work of the great Erasmus at the time of the Reformation and the time of the Renaissance? His picture of what should have been the world if Martin Luther hadn't happened, in which there would be universal peace and justice and war would be abandoned. And Fukuyama is really that kind of figure. Unfortunately, of course, the liberal account of humanity is wrong. We are not the same. Differences are not accidental. Differences are fundamental. And as it were, all the things that Fukuyama held up before us have fallen to pieces. He summarized his idea that the future of man was, of course, the abandonment of the nation state, and instead there would be the emergence of this thing that we call the universal homogeneous state, which all forms of ideological difference have vanished because, of course, liberal democracy has triumphed. So there are no longer any fundamental questions, there are no longer any serious debates about politics. The only debate is how we become yet more prosperous. And as it were, the embodiment of all of this is, of course, the EU perceived as an ideal construct. Well, the EU had Brexit. Extraordinary direct challenge to those assumptions. We look again at, John has already mentioned, one of the other things that Fukuyama was absolutely convinced about was that because it satisfies all human needs, the universal homogeneous state is also peculiarly stable. Its framework of values is fundamentally unchallengeable. There's nothing that you can get beyond democracy. Well, of course, as he pointed out, woke challenges absolutely, fundamentally, every one of the assumptions of liberalism, of the liberal state, and so on. And then we've had, of course, the idea of a globalized international order, partly financial, partly industrial. Of course, by the way, going back to those sort of liberal enterprises, the British Empire and the semi-empire of America, constructed on the ruins of the British Empire, challenged radically by the financial crisis of 2008 and what is going on now in response to the Ukraine crisis, the staggering reversal of trends from superfluity. I mean, remember, we have all grown up, people of John's age and myself, of a world in which everything has got cheaper and cheaper, in which labor costs have got high, but the cost of actual material goods have got lower, so living standards have constantly risen. Everything, with the exception of occasionally of fuel and whatever, has got cheaper and cheaper. Suddenly, a violent reversal of this pattern. So everywhere you look, and of course, particularly in international relations, the crashing failure in the last few months of the United Nations, held up before us all as a simple absurdity. Guterres doing nothing more. I mean, do we all know what Guterres actually did in New York at the time of the outbreak of the Ukrainian war? He issued a statement which said literally, quoting Lenin, "Give peace a chance." You know, the sheer preposterous futility of the thing on which so many hopes had been built. So, what do we do? Where do we go? What foundation do we find for ourselves? And putting it more sharply, should we necessarily be very surprised? Because I would like to advance a point, which is that liberalism, this doctrine of the individual who is, as it were, born free of human and social of historical context, of human context, this individual entering as a matter of will into all relations with others, essentially to achieve his or her or its or theirs, depending on whichever pronouns you use, liberty. There is no reason for liberalism ever to stop. It is by definition self-destructive. And this is one of the great problems, I think, we have not fully registered. If we've been having this conversation 100-odd years ago in the 19th century, liberalism was the doctrine fundamentally identified with the nation state. Hence the liberation, the various movements of national liberation all over Europe, many of which were sponsored by Britain, with, of course, Gladstone, the great liberal politician of the late 19th century, the famous speeches about the Turkish horrors in the Balkans and driving the Turks out, bag and baggage, and whatever. So we've got to, I think, have a fundamental understanding of the fact that liberalism is a self-destructive doctrine. That is to say, it is no accident that if you like, the early Enlightenment, the Enlightenment of Voltaire, even to an extent, the Enlightenment of Rousseau, finishes in revolution, finishes on the scaffold, finishes in the terror. So we shouldn't then perhaps be too surprised by woke. We shouldn't perhaps be too surprised by the way liberation doctrines have become self-consuming. So we've got then an attempted foundation of political organization, stability, international order, and whatever, in a reading of human nature, which, as I would say, I think is fundamentally wrong. Now, why do I think it's wrong? I'm going to invoke a name quite a lot, which is that of St. Augustine. St. Augustine gives, I'm sure we're all familiar, a very different picture of human nature. He emphasizes the absolute passivity, the absolute dependence of the human being, and also, of course, the fact of the literal biological fact. If you think of the opening of Rousseau's Social Contract, that man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains, have a sillier 3 words than man is born free ever been written. Every woman here knows how man and woman is born. To quote Augustine in a more respectable form than the original Latin, you're born amidst urine and feces. You're an absolutely dependent creature of time, place, and circumstance. So this notion of the abstract individual is the merest construct and is therefore of use only if the construct works, and as we've seen, the construct doesn't actually work. So how then do we, many of us, most of us, I think, would call ourselves conservatives, how do we answer this failed liberalism with a conservatism that has some chance of standing up and a conservatism that might survive? That's the question that I really want to ask. And I would like then to pick up with the remark that I made just now. That's to say that liberalism is essentially founded on a doctrine of human similarity. I think what the conservative wishes to do is, on the contrary, and therefore is unnatural, despite all its parading of natural law, is fundamentally unnatural, does not answer to human circumstance or to the reality of the human condition. Whereas the account that's given by Augustine, unpleasant and brutal though it is actually accurate. Human beings vary enormously in their physical capacity, their mental capacity, their emotional stability, and of course, above all, they vary in the inheritance of their culture. Liberalism ignores culture. It regards culture merely as superficial, which is why many of the catastrophes of liberalism happened. It's liberalism, the idealism, the absurdity of liberalism is responsible for, has there ever been a more fatuous military adventure? A more horrible, of course, in its consequences, but fatuous in its inspiration than the invasion of Afghanistan, which had as one of its aims to enable women to wear miniskirts. You know, the sheer fatuousness of it, the absurdity, the cultural indifference, and so on. So I think then I want, as a conservative, to say we begin with a notion of human specificity, of difference, of initial dependence, of cultural derivation. That's where we should start. Now, this raises, of course, some profoundly uncomfortable questions. The first of which, of course, is to recognize, as Adlai Stevenson put it magnificently at the beginning of the 1960s, what we talked about as universal values were Western values. They were no more. And the entire enterprise of the United Nations was, as the Soviets often and accurately argued, effectively a piece of American ideological imperialism, which has met, curiously, very oddly, and we can discuss, I won't go into this in detail, it actually, oddly enough, provided precisely the machinery that the Soviets used to limit things like freedom of speech or whatever, using the gap between these vast general claims of universal declarations of human rights and the reality of race discrimination in America or imperialism in Britain. You're able, in fact, to undercut magnificently the grandiose claims of the West and, of course, to pander to the emerging nations or former colonies or whatever of the old Western empires. So then, having said those things about diversity, rootedness, experience, and whatever, How do we find a ground for politics within them? Well, once again, I would like to go back to St. Augustine. Augustine, of course, is famous for one of the most important books in the history of Western civilization, and indeed it lies at the foundation of the history of the West. It's the City of God. Because, of course, all the questions we are asking now, the questions that I'm asking, the questions about what is the roots of the legitimacy of government, its relationship to human nature, and so on, are not new questions. We talk about them as though they were relatively new questions. On the contrary, they're profoundly old questions. And Augustine, again, is doing precisely what Edmund Burke did when he wrote in reaction to the French Revolution, what Disraeli did when he was dealing with the gigantic changes of late 19th century English society, his deliberate broadening of the franchise. In other words, they are responding to extraordinary crisis-ridden times of their own that are undergoing vast change. And St. Augustine, of course, let's put him in his context. I've been arguing for the importance of context. St. Augustine is arguing and writing in the immediate response to the cataclysmic event that effectively ends the Roman Empire in the West. That is the capture of Rome twice in a single year, not so much its sacking, but the looting of its treasures by Alaric the Visigoth. That moment at which, and remember, a city which had been untouched for 800 years falls. And it falls, of course, when it's adopted Christianity. And the great question is there a relationship between the fall of Rome and the adoption of Christianity? If you're familiar with Gibbon's much later great account of the Roman Empire and its fall, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, he argues as far as he dared in 18th century England that the adoption of Christianity is directly responsible for the fall of Rome, that it is an antithetical set of values. And this, I think, again, is where we should debate this. This, I think, is how we should really see woke. Woke, in many ways, is a perverted form of Christianity. If you think of what it's trying to do in reversing the power structure, it's the Magnificat translated into bad English. He shall cast down the mighty from their seats and exalt them of low degree. That's good. These things are perverted forms of religion, and particularly perverted forms of some aspects of Christianity. So what Augustine has got to do, Augustine has got to address the question, was Christianity responsible for the fall of Rome? Interestingly enough, he avoids the question, like so many of us, when the question is very difficult. What he says instead, he simply denies that the pagan Roman state had any moral value at all. He denies that human society, because of course he is arguing for the fallen state of man, he believes in original sin, as it were, the badge of what I was talking about being born amidst the sins of the flesh and excrement and whatever, is that you carry this badge of mortal sin from the beginning. Therefore, nothing that human hands can do this is the diversity, the fragility of the human condition, interpreted in the most literal and hostile fashion. Nothing that you can do will actually be of lasting value. Nothing will have moral sanction or moral validity. And it's very interesting when everybody tries to deduce notions of the state from an idea of God or religion, the real founder of the Western Church rejects absolutely any such notion. According to St. Augustine, the only society that has value is the city of God, which is both the church militant upon earth and the church as the faithful have ascended to heaven. But that, of course, raises this absolute fundamental question. Does human society have values? Can we find a root of value? And here, because we've only got a few minutes, I will have to leap over centuries with the kind of gesture of the television presenter and say these kind of questions, as we all know in the Middle Ages, there were attempts at the various forms of the sanctification of the state, the extraordinary fact that in the West, very much again following what had happened in Rome in 410, you actually develop two rival institutions of both earthly and spiritual power, the pretensions of the Holy Roman Empire on the one hand and of the papacy on the other. And as I've been arguing repeatedly, in discussions in the few days that I've been here, I see the origins of Western freedom essentially as the conflict of these two. But let's leap over all of that to my own particular period, my period of the 16th century. The English in the 16th century debate exactly what Augustine set out. They take the debate is framed by Augustine. It's expressed by the great genius of Sir Thomas More, or St. Thomas More, depending on your views of the man, in two of the most famous works of not simply the 16th century, but of the human spirit. One of them, of course, is Utopia, and the other, his account of the idealized society, which is pagan, but nevertheless embodies what he regards as Christian values of the rejection of earthly wealth and a kind of quasi-communist managed society. On the one hand, this imaginary island, the no place here is what it literally means. And then the very much, in other words, the abstract place, the city of God without, as it were, God. Utopia is the city of God without God. It's a consideration of what an earthly working version of the city of God might actually look like. The other very much place here, that's somewhere that is actually a place, is, and the linkage is not normally made, but I can demonstrate the closeness of it, is his history of the reign of Richard III. And his history of the reign of Richard III is intended to do what the first part of the city of God does, which is to demonstrate that the English state is so morally and absolutely corrupt that you cannot derive value from it. That is why, of course, and Richard III is the absolute ideal king to do this. You know, the murder of his nephews, the brutality, the cynicism. I mean, there are powerful streaks in Richard III, as represented by Shakespeare, of either the absurdist king au bourgeois or indeed of Donald Trump. If you actually look at the behavior of Richard III on stage, the laughing, the joking, the bizarre, undercutting, sinister humor, the whole thing is a deliberate contempt of value. The thing that is striking, and that should strike us, is that this challenge was picked up. The English decide, or most English decide, Thomas More loses the argument. I think it's fair to say Thomas More loses every argument, but you know, that's why he becomes a martyr and lives on in all our memories. But Thomas More loses the great argument about the validity of the English state. And you can see a sequence of writers building up from only a few years after him who consciously say, Thomas More talked about an ideal commonwealth. I'm not interested in an ideal commonwealth. I want to talk about England as it is now. So you get Thomas Eliot in the Book of the Governor, showing how the new Renaissance, the new Renaissance techniques, in other words, the political and political, social, rhetorical inheritance that you've got from Rome can be applied to the English ruling class. You can make Roman gentlemen out of English gentlemen by a process of education. My namesake, Thomas Starkey, in an unpublished work, but a very, very important one, The Dialogue Between Poole and Lupset, written in the 1530s, does something even more astonishing. He sees the English aristocracy as a new Roman senatorial aristocracy who can actually restore virtue to England, that they can be the people who will reform government under the king. And finally, by the time that you've got to Thomas Smith, at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, in a work again with a Latin title, but actually very, very much England and about England, the De Republica Anglorum, about the English Republic, he begins in this extraordinary way. He says, Thomas More wrote about an ideal world. I want to write about my country. Now, on the 24th of June, 1569, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and this is the best place to live, so there. And he then develops the study of English institutions, the patterns of English government, the patterns of English law, and sees in them the basis for a proper, functioning, fundamentally fair polity. In other words, he is looking not to abstracts, not to philosophical principles. He is looking to a historical, tradition and to a tradition of institutional continuity. And it seems to me that already there you have the actual foundation of what we should be doing. But of course, and again having to abbreviate very heavily, this is shot across once again by religion. This is the moment when the Reformation hits England. Well, it doesn't hit England, it's directly adopted by Henry VIII. Henry VIII actually makes himself the head of the church, which on the one hand, of course, elevates the monarchy to a gigantic pitch of power, but on the other hand, in an age of controversy, means that the monarchy is the target of opposition in a way which had never been before. Because, of course, in an age where religion matters more than politics, the only important political question is if you're a Catholic, is the monarch Catholic or Protestant, or if you're a Protestant, the other way around. And strikingly, in the middle of the 16th century, one of the most extraordinary and little-known books, Bishop Ponet's Treatise of Politic Power, is a kind of Sunday Times expose. It's like Richard III, but what it does, it gives you a blow-by-blow account of how wicked his own men, the Protestants of the reign of Edward VII, were, but he does it with a biblical text, "Put not your trust in princes." Again, exactly that same pulling back from politics. So here we've then got this picture of an England which sort of recognizes itself and recognizes institutional continuity. And can I just say, this is actual matter of fact. Already by the 16th century, you are looking at a structure of government which is nearly 450 years old. And moreover, a structure of government which after that has never been radically challenged, save in the unsuccessful revolution of the middle years of the 17th century. And even with the repeated challenges of the 18th and the 19th and the early 20th century over questions like the representation of new social groups, whereas in every other European state, existing structures had to be pulled down to accommodate the new groups. The traditions of English politics, as they were praised by Thomas Smith, by Thomas Starkey, and by Thomas Eliot, so they're all called Thomas, by Thomas Eliot, actually held. They were strong enough and tensile enough to open. In other words, in England, you do not campaign to tear down Parliament or the monarchy, you campaign to be represented in Parliament. In other words, it's what we have in England is a legacy of reform, not revolution. And this I think, will form one of the natural points at which I begin to draw to a conclusion. If we look then, again, more closely, I referred to them both briefly, if we look to Burke and Disraeli, the two founders of real conservatism, more closely, we will actually see how these ideas shape and determine theirs. Burke is a remarkable figure. Burke is like me. He's a convert. I'm a convert to conservatism, as I said. I was quite straightforward, radical liberal, I suppose, sort of liberal universalist, more particularly a libertarian, until I wakened up. I saw what was happening beginning about 10 years ago and realized that we were confronting a genuine threat to everything that mattered and everything that was of value. Burke, of course, Burke was a radical Whig. Burke was in complete with the Whig tradition. He believed in economical reform. He resisted the power of the monarchy. He denounced most aspects of the British Empire. And then he suddenly confronts the horror of the French Revolution. And the way he describes it is exactly as I've been talking about. He says the French Revolution is about abstract reason. It is about reason removed from contact with reality. So you decide, and he gives many illustrations of it, but the obvious illustrations are things like the fact we decide everything should be to base 10. Well, of course, quite good for decimal currency, moderately good for the metric system, but rather silly if you try and make 10 hours in the day, 10 days in the week, and 10 months in the year, with the catastrophes of the French revolutionary calendar, the obliteration of every single internal geographical frontier in France. In other words, the attempt, as the liberal enterprise demands, that you begin simply from the individual and reason, you wipe a slate clean, you extirpate the variousness, the irrationality of history, and you begin clean, and you construct new, and you construct big, and you construct beautiful, and you are a bit like a modernist architect. And we all know what the results of modern architecture are. And Burke then gives us this radically different picture, a picture that we should recognize history, that we should recognize the embeddedness, the inheritance of value, that we should recognize, and this again is profoundly important, conservatism is not simply stasis. The past is not a straitjacket. History is not determinism. What Burke is clear about, what Disraeli are clear about, completely on the contrary, is that society changes. The issue is not stopping change. The issue is how you change. Do you change in accordance with the values of your country, or do you change in accordance with the values of abstract reason? Let me give you an illustration from the catastrophe that England underwent in the 1990s with the then Labour government, using simply the model, the preposterous model of the separation of powers based on Montesquieu's fantastic misunderstanding of the English Constitution. It deliberately created, because of course, what did we do? We actually had a Supreme Court, effectively, that sat in the upper house of the legislature. You can't possibly have that. So you create a Supreme Court, which immediately starts to behave like an American Supreme Court, which is a very bad idea, in my view, as we can see from the whole dispute over Roe versus Wade. Again, you had a highly functioning head of the legal system who was also a cabinet minister, was also the Speaker of the House of Lords, and was also a politician, of course, which contrives to challenge every single one of the principles of the separation of powers. So we half abolished the office of Lord Chancellor, and the legal system has never recovered. So that's the wrong application of reform and whatever. And what I want to finish on, finally, is why English history escapes the woke challenge. If we look in America, the challenge of the 1619 project, that there is a fundamental and irredeemable gulf between the high claims of the revolution and the low reality of slavery and race relations. I'm afraid you have to admit there's some very substantial truth in the statement. On the other hand, if you look at the statement, which is the attempt of transferring it to England, that there is in fact that the history of slavery in the British Empire acts as exactly a similar process of delegitimization of that history that I was talking about, then I think you've got a very, very straightforward answer. It is absolutely true that for a brief moment in the 18th century, the British Empire was, because it was the world power, it was the leading slaving power. It is all, unfortunately, of course, every power, when it had the opportunity, was the world's leading slave power when it had the opportunity. The British had the opportunity, and they took it. What makes them unique is they then abolish slavery. And they then not only abolish slavery, they deliberately extirpate it throughout the world at enormous cost, enormous political cost. So you have this curious business in British history that it is a kind of solution to itself, that the contradictions resolve. I know that sounds very Hegelian, because it's not simply the business of slavery. The British Empire, again, is unique. Following the rebellion of the American colonies, there is the Durham Report into Canada, which consciously envisages that Canada will become an independent dominion under the Crown. And that rule is generalized in the Statute of Westminster of 1931. The British Empire, in other words, is unique in that it wills its own end and survives in the form of what we call the Anglo-sphere, of states which have inherited the literal inheritance of England. In other words, to a substantial extent, what I've been talking about, the English experience, is genuinely transmitted to America, Canada, New Zealand, wherever, even indeed to for example, to Israel, which consciously incorporates English law and a parliamentary system, and so on. And this seems to me, and of course culminating finally in the extraordinary fact that we are a royal republic. that every single act of Parliament is still, we were talking about decorations, every single act of Parliament, its only authority is that of the Queen. The formal statement is, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent majesty with merely the advice and consent of the Lord Spiritual and Temporal. But as we all know, it's a useful historical fiction. Fiction and history and this merging and telling of stories seems to me to be the grounds to which we have to hold, the grounds on which we have to persuade others to communicate that sense of the past and its continuing ability to fertilize the present and to shape the future. Thank you.
David, I want to thank you very warmly for that address. I think when you, in a sense, start with St. Augustine and end with the woke, you have a real tour d'horizon of political and religious thought. And I think it's been an extremely, not just a tour d'horizon, but a tour d'horizon conducted on a roller coaster. So a fantastically interesting moment. Now, I welcome to the stage John Fonte. Professor Fonte is a man who has done his best to prevent the left seizing control of the historical standards in American education, and did in fact fight an extremely effective battle in the 1980s and 90s to prevent that happening. Unfortunately, a lot has gone wrong since then. He has now devoted his attention to, more recently, to preventing a globalist and a globalist movement eradicating all the boundaries of different countries and states and instituting a kind of deracinated international law on societies of a very different kind. His book, Sovereignty or Submission, which I'm happy to say is just about to be translated into Hungarian, is an important book. I had the pleasure of actually writing the introduction to it. Very important book, which I think reflects the increasing wisdom we have as we see the chaos of wokeism approaching us and attempting to inflict itself on us. So, John, perhaps I could ask you to come to the lectern and deliver your own approach.
Well, thank you, David. That was quite interesting, and I agree with I think most of it. Talks about the crisis of liberalism. Liberalism, of course, has morphed into something else. Earlier this morning, when I received this award from the Hungarian government, I made the point that the Hungarians were among the first to rise against communism in 1956, and are also among the first to rise against, let's call it wokeism, today. So, and wokeism itself is not new. Goes back perhaps to, you could say, Lucifer's rebellion, or in the early Middle Ages, the Gnostics, the experts who had power. Then obviously the French Revolution, finally the Bolsheviks, the Maoists. Now in a much, at this point at least, softer form, the present woke revolution, which is happening throughout the world, particularly in the West and particularly in the United States and Britain. This is the challenge and I think David started sketching it out rather well, and that wokeism is, in a sense, a form of perverted religion. Now, David's talk was, as an Englishman, was Anglo-centric. So as an American, I'm going to have a more American-oriented conception. First of all, we're both, I think, in agreement on what conservatives should do, or what is the reaction, what is the resistance to wokeism. And from what I gathered and what he was saying, it's to go to our history, to go to our inheritance, and to go to our realism rather than an abstract or ideal situation. And I agree with all of that. But there is, again, probably an agreement, no universal answer for conservatism. Conservatism is, well, there are some generalities, but again, it's a separate, it depends upon the nation, it depends upon their history, it depends upon the circumstances. Hungarian history, British history, American history are different, and therefore the conservatism in those countries is different. Now I think David will probably disagree with some of the things I'm going to say now, because we had some discussions last night and talked about natural rights, laws of nature, this sort of thing. So I think I'm going to provoke him a little bit on this. What American conservatives want to do is to conserve America, and that means the regime and the way of life that was established by the American founders, and that would be all of the American founders. And the American founders, the basic American regime was founded on two pillars, the culture that David mentioned. So that's the story of America, it's the history, and also the creed, the ideological, philosophical elements, which I'll get to in a moment. I think we'll start with the culture. The culture, of course, is this story, which has certain highlights, whether it was the tenacity and the character of George Washington, Valley Forge, the expansion across the Western Plains, the creation by entrepreneurs in the late 19th century of the greatest economy that the world has ever known, the Civil War, Gettysburg, which sort of purged, at least began to purge some of the past, slavery in the past, the emergence as a world power beginning in the 20th century, the return to the old world and the rescue of the old world against National Socialism and communism. So this is sort of the story, the traditional story of America and the traditional inheritance, and this is repeated by right-of-center politicians. You look at President Trump's speech on the Mount Rushmore speech. When it's Mount Rushmore, it went through all of this, and the American story would include jazz and the whole cultural aspects of let's say, modern and popular culture as well. So that's part of the history of America. The history of America also includes the creed, and that's really, in a sense, part of the culture. I mean, at the center of the creed is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. The Declaration of Independence was not simply a document written by Thomas Jefferson. It was a document representing the Continental Congress. It represented, in other words, the thought of the American revolutionaries at that time. And what Jefferson said he was asked a little after the Declaration, what did you mean by the Declaration? Where did you get your ideas? What was this all about? And he said something very interesting. He said there was nothing new in this declaration. It is simply it's simply the wisdom of mankind up to now. It's it's the accumulated wisdom. And he mentions four people. He said for example, they accumulated wisdom, and then he mentions 4 specific figures in political philosophy. He says Aristotle, it's the ideas of Aristotle, of Cicero, of Sidney, the English Republican, and John Locke. But essentially, it's what people thought of as civilization. And that's why he talked about the laws of nature and nature's God. So there was all of the founders, Jefferson and Madison on the, let's say, left of center, the Democratic Republicans, and all of the Federalists, the more conservative parties, which was Washington and Hamilton and Adams and John Jay. And this was exemplified more or less in the Federalist Papers, although Madison was part of that too. All of them believed in natural rights. I mean, they believed that all men are created equal. That's a big argument, or what does it mean? We discussed this a little bit at dinner. They didn't mean, of course, that everybody is exactly equal. They meant they're equal in the sight of God, and they should be equal before the law. Now, obviously, this wasn't totally the case with slavery and voting, property rights, or some property rights for voting until Andrew Jackson came along. So then we had a Civil War, which sort of fulfilled some of this, and it wasn't completely fulfilled because there was segregation for another 100 years, Jim Crow in the South, and then finally we had the Civil Rights Act, which ended some of this, but brought in, as Christopher Caldwell's brilliant book of last year, it also brought in, it was distorted, and instead of having equal rights before the law, we now have wokeism, which is group rights, and rights based on race, ethnicity, and gender. So this is a perversion of the American regime and a perversion of the natural rights doctrine. And I'm going to poke Professor Starkey a little bit here. We had a discussion last night. He said, well, American culture is British. It's totally British. You know, you accepted the common law. Well, let's take a look at that for a moment. We do have a common law system, which is, of course, is case law. It's not the European continental. It's not the European system. It's based on cases. So in that sense, it is inherited for Britain. But our concept of citizenship is different from the common law and different from, in fact, it's an expressed repudiation of it. American citizenship wasn't codified right away. It was hinted at by the founders, but again, it was based on natural law and based on the social compact, which means one voluntarily becomes a citizen. Well, of course, someone is born, they're not going to make a decision at that point. But some of the founders were saying, well, when you're 18 or 19, you can make a decision. If you don't like the system, you can go to England or you can leave. If you stay, that's sort of implied consent. You've given your consent. So the whole question of implied consent, you're consenting to the social contract. So you're staying here. So that was the beginning of the sort of concept of natural rights, voluntary citizenship. Then came American citizenship. Then was clearly defined during Reconstruction. Right after the Civil War, there was Reconstruction Congress. So they had to define citizenship because earlier there had been a Supreme Court decision that said blacks were not citizens, the Dred Scott decision. So they defined it in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, saying all people born in the United States but not subject to a foreign power. So 8 children who were, say, the children of Europeans who were visiting Americans were not supposed to necessarily be citizens. So they passed then the Expatriation Act, which said which specifically in the language and in the debates in Congress said, we repudiate the common law concept of perpetual allegiance. Once an Englishman, always an Englishman. That was repudiated. In fact, it was more or less that was one of the causes of the War of 1812 between Britain and the U.S., was American sailors were impressed who had previously been British subjects. In fact, the great lawmakers of Britain, Coke and Blackstone, never used the word citizen. It was always a subject. So the Reconstruction Congress, when they created the Civil Rights Act of 66, the Expatriation Act of 1868, and finally the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment of 1868, all they said, we specifically repudiate the concept of birthright citizenship, a birthright subjectship, because that's a feudal doctrine. That was the words used, a feudal doctrine, which is different from a subject being different from a citizen. So they passed that all. Then later there, I'm not going to go into all their various controversies because there's a question of whether someone's born in the United States is a citizen. But what my whole point of saying this is this: the culture was originally English, but it was a break certainly on the question of citizenship. It was a break on some aspects of what is a citizen in context of the whole question of the common law. So it was a break on some of those points. But getting back to, I think, the major point that Professor Starkey was making is that the conservative resistance to wokeism is going to be different in every country, although we have formed a national conservative movement. We've had several conferences. I see Mario, the editor here of the European Conservative. He's been, I think, to all of the national conservative conferences. And I think I got this award partly because I've been involved in the national conservatism and emphasized the importance of Hungary and Poland as resistance to the globalists, and also this is exactly what Brexit has done. But Professor Starkey just gave us a brilliant rendition of British history, but this is British conservatism. It's different from American conservatism, but we're all in the same boat in the battle against the woke revolution. And I'm going to stop there.
Now, let's begin a brief discussion. I'm going to ask David and John a couple of questions, and then I'm going to invite you to throw in some questions too, and indeed points that you might want to make. I want to take a quotation which I know is dear to your heart, David, namely Disraeli's remarks in the free trade speech, and wonder if that isn't a good definition of the way in which conservatisms in different countries can be different and will produce different policies, which is, I think, Disraeli's words were something like, in a progressive society, change is constant. And the question is not whether you should have change, but whether it should be conducted in accordance with the customs and traditions of the people or in deference to abstract philosophical principles. Now, that's what Disraeli said. I think you agree with both of it. Both of you agree with it, I should say. I'd like to wonder if you would like to both comment on it and suggest how what kind of policies and reforms follow from that distinction.
I would absolutely, and indeed I indirectly quoted it in what I was saying. The problem, it seems to me, is self-evidently conservatism. It has to be different in every country because we're drawing upon history, we're drawing upon the locality of experience and human difference. And this, of course, has been the disaster of liberalism, the assumption that all countries should follow the same model. It is an absurdity, a complete absurdity. And you've only got to look at, actually, even within the European Union, how wildly different the political context of France or Germany or of Italy is. It is simply conditioned by their history. But there's a bigger problem, as John illustrated very clearly from what he said. America incorporates liberalism into its very heart. It is actually written into the Constitution, slightly and fundamentally into the Declaration of Independence. This makes it peculiarly vulnerable to the crisis of liberalism. We have to address that woke is fundamentally an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, even though its philosophical background is German philosophy in its most degenerate phase of German idealism, refracted to even worse philosophers in France. But America's vulnerability comes precisely from the penetration of liberalism into its heart. And I'm sorry, I do think,
and I'm going to say, I am now going to be deliberately provocative, I think America actually faces the prospect of another civil war, precisely on those grounds. And I think what I think you fail to do is to recognize the fact that the conservative interpretation of the American Revolution can be so easily overthrown with the faintest touch of either both logic and history.
Okay, good. We have a clear disagreement, which is always good.
I always right.
America is not based on liberalism. It's based on republicanism. Liberalism didn't even exist in the 18th century. In any sense. I mean, the word liberal was not used in a political sense. The only way that George Washington used the word liberal was, I'm liberal in the sense of I'm an open, a gentleman, right? It's not. It had nothing to do with politics. What it's clear from all of the races, the word was Republican. We're a republic, which is government by consent of the governed. It's a consensual regime. Liberalism came to view in the 19th century, and the early liberalism was not a problem. That was free speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press. It was the liberalism of Mazzini, of Kossuth, of Abraham Lincoln, and Daniel Webster, of Gladstone, and so on.
It doesn't know when to stop.
Right. So, but the American regime itself was not a liberal regime, and it was not a completely modern regime. So if I can lay out, I'm more or less a fellow traveler of the West Coast Straussians, the Claremont in Hillsdale School, and drawing on, say, Harry Jaffa, Leo Strauss, their argument was that, America is usually seen as a modern state, as a modern regime. It's Locke and Hobbes and Hume, and it's 18th century, and it's a rejection of the ancients, the ancient world. It's a rejection of at least religion as a powerful political force. But I think what Jaffa, who was a great teacher of Claremont for maybe 50 years, said, well, actually, America is not a completely liberal regime. America is partly an ancient regime. It goes back. It has pre-liberal roots, and those pre-liberal roots are basically two things. They're the conception of the ancients, that would be the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and the Romans. Their belief in human nature and natural rights. That human nature is unchanging. That's clear in the Federalist Papers. They do not accept a fluid form of human nature, but say it's unchanging, drawing from the ancients. And Christianity and religion certainly was a key factor in the American Revolution. The American Revolution is founded on had a couple of sources, and one was Christians, and particularly dissenting Protestant ministers who were sort of rallying the forces in New England in the American Revolution. That was one of the aspects. One is what Professor Starkey has said is Locke and Hume and David Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment, the more moderate wing, not the continental French wing, but the more moderate wing of the Enlightenment. Greece and Rome, I mean, they read Plutarch. They modeled themselves after the ancients. So these are not liberal roots. These are pre-liberal. I mean, Greece and Rome, Christianity, concept of natural rights going right back to the beginning. Plato and Aristotle, Aristotle and Cicero, as Jefferson mentioned. These are all non-liberal roots, all pre-liberal roots. So I would say that America was not fundamentally liberal in formation. And obviously, there is some element of liberalism that's come into being in the 19th century, and then later we had the liberalism of the late 19th century. But that turned into progressivism. So progressive liberalism is the offshoot. This is what we now call woke. So I don't think it's that's a common statement, though, that America is a liberal regime. America is the quintessential liberal regime.
We're fighting over a word which is not getting us very far. You made the key statement. America is essentially founded on the concept of unchanging and universal natural right. That is the catastrophe of America.
Okay, well,
That's the story.
yeah. That's the Declaration of Independence. So if we abandon that, we abandon everything. Because that is part of the history, that's part of the inheritance. So that is central. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are central to America and what it means to be an American.
Can I turn?
So it's beyond simply a question. It's also historical. It's also a cultural artifact. So it's not simply a question. It's not simply an ideological artifact, but it's tied in with the culture. And there is that when we talk about natural rights, when we talk about all men are created equal. Again, we're not talking about. And Lincoln talked about this in his debates with Douglas. That doesn't mean everybody's exactly the same. It doesn't mean, even as he said at the time, that the races were exactly equal in their acceptance of modernity or what they're doing. It doesn't mean that people are different in intelligence and size. Some are good looking, some are not. Some are intelligent, some are not. But they're all equal in the eyes of God. So that's a pre-modern, non-liberal view of the American founding. They should be equal before the law. That wasn't exactly established in the 18th century, but eventually was. It's certainly the case here. And I would contend that the leadership of the American founders, the American Revolution, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Franklin. So I'm going to take a very chauvinist statement here. This was the greatest leadership. It beats the British leadership of Disraeli and Gladstone. They were great, but I put the American founders as a leadership class against any leadership class that has ever existed in the history of the world. That goes back to Greece and Rome. It includes the papacy. It includes Renaissance figures. It includes the France of Louis XIV, 19th century Britain. I would put those against any leadership form, against any leadership class, any elite in world history. And what they came up with was a regime the closest to what we could do with human nature. And that was examined in both, that's clear in both the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. I'll just say one more thing about the Declaration before Professor Starkey could respond. It has two parts. One is we're laying out our position for all of mankind. So it was an explanation why we were breaking this, why it was necessary why one people is separating from another. So it was, as 18th century gentlemen, we're going to explain to the world, we're going to explain to others. That's part of it. And then he laid out all of the reasons, the king stirring up the Indians and this and that, and not accepting, stopping immigration from coming to the United States. They listed a series of reasons. And then they gave the overall philosophy of the regime, which was a form of a type of Christianity, that all men are created equal in the eyes of God, nature and nature's God. And it also has the secular aspect. So if Americans surrender, say we don't believe in the principles of the Declaration, we don't believe in natural rights, we don't believe in this, then we're doomed. Because that is America, that is a good part of America, backed by this culture. So it's a creed and a culture. And they work together. And if we are going to stop wokeism, if we're going to do this, this is the only way that an American nationalist resistance to what is going on today can be effectuated.
David, please do reply if you wish to what John has said. I then want to turn to you and ask you a question about the English tradition.
I want to be very, very brief. I would agree broadly with what you said about both America and the Founding Fathers. What I was trying to point out is that for the very reason that I gave at the beginning, that a doctrine of universal natural rights has demonstrated itself completely clearly to be one that self-destructs. We see this everywhere we look. Now, the fact that America has sort of held that process off is a tribute to the structure that was created. But I think rather than just trumpeting what happened, you need to look at why you were so vulnerable You need to look at why woke has taken off in the way that it is and how it is genuine cancer. And it can even draw on aspects of the American historical tradition. And I think we should stop. We've both set our relative positions
Just
on
one-
this.
No,
We've
well, except
we've
one-
set our positions clearly.
1619 is a repudiation of the founding. It's not the founding. Okay.
Well, my question is, aren't you getting England off scot-free in relation to liberalism? In many respects, isn't England the place from which liberalism was founded? Wasn't it the revolution of 1688 that first introduced it into the political world? And if it went wrong in English history as well as in
The
American
foundation
history.
of the Labour Party.
Yes, well, that sort of thing, yes, exactly. And I was wondering where you thought it did go wrong. Well, the foundation of the Labour Party is perhaps your reply, but over to you.
What I think you've got to understand is that John Locke did not shape the revolution of 1689. John Locke was a series of abstract doctrines that were not applied at all by the revolution of 1689. The revolution of 1689 deliberately avoided Locke. The revolution of 1689, on the contrary, did something extremely clever. It told a series of lies, almost as big as the lies about George III in the Declaration of Independence. It told a series of lies about the fact that James II had abdicated, and therefore preserved an illusion of continuity. But it did the very wise thing of forcing the incoming king to swear to the Bill of Rights. So in other words, it sets up a series of doctrines in the same way when you gave that lineage going back, Cicero through Sidney and all the rest of it. You're looking at an extraordinarily selective thread of Western thought, which, far from representing the whole inheritance, represents a single, important, but skewed version of it, and one that I think does not provide, unlike the Catholicity of the English inheritance, where we have contrived to, I think, digest both conservatism and liberalism in a way which is unrevolutionary. And that seems to me to be the key. Yours is a revolution which is successful only because it's a rather half-hearted one, that it deliberately doesn't do what the French Revolution did or what the Russian Revolution did.
Of course.
But that is, again, America straddles exactly the point that you made, that it's a sort of ancien regime, but draping itself in new dress. I don't think you can actually produce that story of reconciliation of opposites that I tried to offer. The current attack on the statue of the Confederacy, that deliberate obliteration of 100 years of American history, thank God so far, is inconceivable in Britain.
Well, they're operating, though, in opposition to the American way of life and regime. They've said that specifically. They're anti-American. So ours was a political revolution, not a social revolution. Obviously, that's correct. And great difference of the French Revolution is ours was in accordance with human nature, and there was the attempt to transcend and transform human nature, and that's exactly what the current woke revolutionaries want to transcend human nature. We've been having transhumanism as one of their goals. So this is a repudiation of the American regime. It's not part of it.
Well, now let us do, as Professor Starkey suggested, there's a lady with a microphone. Would anyone like to intervene with some questions to either or both of the speakers?
I must say that I grew up thinking that history was history. That I could sort of count on it. It was what happened in the past, and in my mind, this business of rewriting history in the 1619 project that was done by Hannah Jones just doesn't make sense to me. And what I don't quite understand is how it has taken on so much life. You, Professor Starkey, seem to say that it's because of the basis that liberalism will kill itself. And I'm trying to understand how that can happen.
I think that the reason that the 1619 project has developed in a quite extraordinary way is that America does have, I fear, a fatal inheritance, which is the contradiction between everything in the Declaration and slavery. And that simply cannot be glossed over. So, do you see what I mean? In a sense...
Why not? I
Pardon?
mean, in other words, slavery existed for a period of time.
Yes, I know,
and
but sorry,
it's gone.
But previous, right? Again, you see, let me be fairly brutal back. The extraordinary flaw in the American experience was seized in a single brilliant sentence by a great English Tory, by Samuel Johnson, who says, "Nobody yelps more loudly for liberty than a Yankee slave driver." And this is the key point. If you actually look in British, the same is true in British politics. The radicals, if you go into the Guildhall in London, you look at the statues of people like Beckford. These are the people who are most closely associated with the real radicals like Wilkes. The British Empire is not a Tory enterprise; it's a Whig enterprise. It's why there are so many places called Pitt, with Pitt in it in America. It's William Pitt the Elder, and again, it's. The Roman inheritance made this completely natural. You have liberals who are free, and you have the unfree, and that it's perfectly normal for gentlemen to have slaves. But of course, that becomes this source of division and tension. As I said, there's an attempt at doing it with English history, which doesn't work, because of the extraordinary enterprise of the abolition of slavery as a universe. It begins simply within the British Empire, then the attack on the global slave trade, stopping slaves going to Brazil. The enterprise of the British Navy, about a third of it devotes itself to stopping as you know, Portugal continued. By far the largest slave power, can we get this right, is Portugal. About 5 million of the 10 million that go across the Atlantic go there. So, but I'm sorry, that's my take. I'm sure, John.
Yeah, well, our abolition
John, just before you come back, yes, would you incorporate into your reply the question of whether or not Henry Clay's plan of buying out slavery, which was in effect followed in the British Empire, would have changed things, or should have changed things in David's view?
Yes, that was a plan, and Lincoln at one point supported it. So that may have improved the situation. But I'm going to make two core points. One, our abolition wasn't naval activity and this sort of thing, but our abolition was the Civil War, in which 2% of the population were killed. So it'd be like today, if 6 million people were killed. So that's we paid in blood for this. Gettysburg was one of the greatest slaughters of all time. The Antietam, it was a new type of warfare. And as I say, 2% of the population, that's quite a bit. So that was paid for, and it's continued. The other point, I think a key point I want to make, is woke revolutionaries from the beginning of time have been in this is not an American issue, it's a universal question. Practically every leading powerful empire or powerful nation, at some point in their history, they're developed an adversarial intelligentsia. That is people who are at the top of that society, or somewhat pampered, or whatever. Some are intellectuals, who then became antagonistic and adversarial to the regime itself. We look at ancient Athens. You had the tyranny of the Ten, the students of Plato and Socrates. They supported Sparta. They were adversarial. They were woke adversarial intellectuals who actually went over to the enemy. So it happened in ancient Greece. It happened with other city-states where they're intellectual, an adversarial. There's intellectuals who support the regime, and then an adversarial bloc who opposed it. The same thing in the Roman Empire. Obviously, it was very much the situation in 18th century France, the entire French Enlightenment, the Diderot, the encyclopedias. They were adversary intellectuals who were part of one of the great societies of that time in history. When they were pampered, they lived well, but they turned against the regime. So that happened in France. It's happened practically every country So this is what wokeism is. I don't think it's a product of American liberalism, and it is, or particularly American liberalism. It is probably a product of this progressive view, but in a broader sense, it's an adversarial group of intellectuals, which has a universal phenomenon and has existed in practically every regime in the history of the world. That's what this is.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, the gentleman right behind. Yes.
First of all, I want to thank you, three of you. You're making such a clear positions, a British position, a US position. To say that I hate wokeism, it's an understatement. I basically lost my son. I have a son in New York, put him through NYT, New York University, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I end up with a son who's woke, smart and everything. You, sir, Mr. Starkey, made a point that our Constitution, I'm putting aside the Declaration of Independence. My son tells me the Constitution, 200-year-old piece of paper. You're talking about teacher, university, charter, whatever, architect design, okay? I took him throughout the world, not just some crazy guy in the basement, okay, who never had a job. And I couldn't reply to him. What am I supposed to say? So just to become maybe more factual, for both of you, how do we fight this woke situation in reality? And I tell you what happened yesterday, very quickly. State Farm Insurance came out and tried to distribute some gender fluid, LGBT booklets through their agents to their customers. All hell broke loose, including me, on True Social. I reached 1 million people. In 3 hours, they backed down, which means go woke, go broke. So as an American, that's one solution we found. What suggestions do you guys have? That's my question. Okay, I don't want to go woke. I don't want to live in a world that is woke. I'm not 18 anymore. I don't feel like changing my life. And a lot of the people here, I don't think even the younger people, they don't want to grow into woke. So you put half of America, let's say, does want to be woke. An estimate, how much of the rest of the world you think doesn't want to be woke? So two questions. What do we do about, and what do you think about the rest of the world outside of America?
John, why don't you start?
Well, you just said, you asked, what do we do? Well, you partly answered your question. I mean, with State Farm, that boycott was one thing. The other thing is what political leaders are doing. In Florida, Disney was brought into, they have to obey the same rules as everybody else. So people are starting to fight back. I'm actually encouraged. This is getting very political here, so changes in the Republican Party. People are awake, is the other term. Lincoln had a group they call the Wide Awakes. That was actually his, they weren't woke, they were anti-woke. So I think people are starting, getting the message. I mean, the problem, I think one of the issues of woke is it's against human nature. The whole transgender argument and something where when you have biological men entering and defeating women in women's sports, I mean, I think we've got 85-90% of the world, the country and probably the world, I think that's something wrong. So I think the woke forces in the end are going to push, they're going to push too far, and it's already happening. There's always, any revolutionary situation, there's always a thermidor, like in the French Revolution. I guess the question is whether those revolutionary advances are kept or whether they're reversed. But I'm starting to see a reversal. So we need regular people, as happened with State Farm, and we need elite political leadership also to push back on that. So that was the answer to that part of your question. And what else? Okay, you want to?
The Constitution is our Achilles heel. That's the point.
What I was saying, well, I tried to. The doctrine of universal human rights is, I'm sorry, I think, false. It's described by Bentham as nonsense on stilts. It is for the simple reason that St. Paul didn't talk about equal in the sight of man, he talked about equal in the sight of God. And it just seems to me, as I tried to begin at the beginning, that the Americans put this fatal, it's very easy to see why. You had to come forward with a better argument than merely we decided to rebel because we actually don't want a monarchy. And by the way, we are tired of paying taxes to you, even though you've defeated the Indians and the French and all the rest, which is why it happens. But I think it is, as you said, it is. No.
Okay,
So let me finish. You've said a lot. It is an Achilles heel. And it's really important that one understands that. It's why woke begins in America. It derives from particular aspects of American society and indeed of American history. And it spreads to countries which share something of those inheritances. In other words, it's essentially an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. It has very much less purchase in the rest of the world. Now, what do we do about it? I'm somebody who was actually cancelled. I have full experience. The key things to understand is that woke spreads fundamentally by cowardice. It spreads by the cowardice of elites. But the reason that the elites give way is because they are liberal elites who are riddled by self-doubt. And they, of course, there were people who were radical when they're young, and they don't want to be out-radicalized when they get old. And I'm afraid, I think it's true in America, and it's certainly true in Britain, they are simply in strategic command of virtually everything. And how one gets rid of them, it is very difficult to know. It may be the fact that we are witnessing a very broad structural crisis in our societies will remove that soft world that you talk about correctly. Because again, what's very striking, and I was interested with what you said about that sense of imperial self-doubt, it used to be the British intellectuals who were almost unique for hating Britain. I mean, it's a phenomenon talked about extensively by George Orwell. He's that wonderful phrase, Orwell again, brilliant use of language. They're the kind of people who would rather steal from a poor box than sing God Save the Queen. And it gives you the sort of person that they are. But American intellectuals, until very recently, were totally on side with America.
Right.
And there is an extraordinary change. Again, very few French intellectuals of the 19th and 20th centuries hated France. It seems to me that we're seeing a peculiarly Anglophone phenomenon, and therefore we should be looking, the recipe that I've given, we should be looking in our own history and the things that we take seriously. Because, if you compare the students of Socrates and whatever, the word for them is traitors.
Right. Well.
Woke are traitors, but it's a very particular form of treachery in that it actually aspires to dissolve and invert the complete institutions of society. It's antinomial. It's much broader than just defund the police. It is defund society. What is the code? It is abolish whiteness. Well, that effectively involves abolishing human civilization. That's the message. White old men who invented everything. I mean, like all the people of the founding fathers, all of whom, I'm afraid, are quite old and emphatically white and invariably men. Yes, right.
Well, I agree. I absolutely agree with most of that. I'm going to get to points where we don't agree. Antinomian, absolutely. As far as I have to get back to the the Declaration of Independence, just one thing. Well, we revolted in the 18th century because we wanted to rule ourselves. It's called the Declaration of Independence. So that's fairly clear. As far as the French now, it was interesting that Macron said there was no such thing as French culture. I would think that that's exactly what. So he was doing a little woke dance too. So I wouldn't say that the French are totally out of this. I mean, there was a strong communist element too with Sartre, who was sort of a poor man's Heidegger in a sense. So and when you go back to Bloomsbury, there was this adversarial intellectual set in Britain. So it wasn't. You're right. The American adversarial intelligentsia came late. I mean, the old liberals of Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy and Arthur Schlesinger celebrated America. America in the 1950s and
But they
60s.
laid the foundations. So I am just trying to show that you're dealing with a continuing body of thought, and you see this pattern repeatedly, as I said, with the early and the late Enlightenment.
I would say it's a break, not rather than a continuation.
Jonathan Israel is right. I think they're continuities. And this is why Burke rejects his Whiggering and reinvents, because again, also conservatism is a new word, by the way, which arises during at exactly the same time as liberalism. The two things are twin phenomena, but they do describe earlier tendencies, which is why we've been using them in a rather lazy fashion, with me setting the lazy example.
Right, another question? Yes, gentleman in the front row.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, but this is an issue that I think is related to the concept of universal natural rights. But do you think, perhaps, that the reason why America has proven to be more vulnerable to wokeness is because I think in Britain, people have very little doubt about who the British people are. There are people who've been living on that land for thousands of years. There's no doubt about that. Whereas in America, I'm American myself. I have ancestors who have been in America since the 17th century. But the way I was raised was to think that, well, being an American just means that you are somebody who happened to be born on American soil, or that somebody who came a few years ago and took a test and then they're magically the same as somebody whose ancestors were around before the time of the Revolution. Of course, the founders did not think of America this way because they defined citizenship as being reserved for white people of good character. Now, of course, putting slavery aside, I mean, I think we can all agree that that's bad, and of course, this conception of citizenship is related to that. But I think it does point to a fundamental problem that there is no actual sense of what the American identity is anymore. And I think the woke crowd is just exploiting this and taking it to its radical but also logical extreme, I would think.
Well, I would say a couple of things here. One is you talked about people coming from other countries, the whole immigration issue. I invented the term patriotic assimilation. So that's a form of assimilation that works, that has worked. It worked with in the past. It worked with the people coming from Ellis Island. It works with some people today, not with everyone. Patriotic assimilation would mean that the immigrant who becomes an American citizen identifies with the whole story of America, and they see Washington. Say, let's take a Korean American. Let's say a ninth grade girl whose family came from Korea. So when she reads American history, we fought the Revolutionary War against Britain. Is she thinking of we Americans? That's Washington and Hamilton and so on. Does she identify there, or does she identify with, well, that was I'm Korean, so those people, that's what white people did in the 18th century. It's not what, it's not, in that case, she's not patriotically assimilated, if that's how she thinks. If she thinks, yeah, they're my ancestors. If she adopts Washington and Lincoln as her ancestors, and the story of America, good and bad, let's say, okay, we had slavery, that was bad, but she's Korean, she had nothing to do with it. Now that's a form of, that's what's sort of made America successful up until now, is patriotic assimilation. The newcomers did, and I think we have a better assimilation. I think we're a little better at that than probably most countries in the world historically. My parents came from Sicily. My father did. He was born, and the others are all Italians. They assimilated pretty quickly. There wasn't any doubt in World War II that they were for America, not for Mussolini. So that's the heart of the that question. What was your other? You had another point that I wanted to address.
Well, I was just suggesting that perhaps it's
about identity.
The lack of a sense of what is the American identity.
Right. Well, we've had American identity has been, I think, fairly strong for until very recently. I mean, I reviewed the National History Standards. That was one of my jobs. I was the Department of Education, and then later opposing it. And they got part of the story right, but they started changing it. They started moving in the woke direction. So I think this is as I've said, it's not unique to America. It's an adversarial intelligentsia. You had this in Hungary. You had Bela Kun and Lukács, who was a leading Marxist. You had where did these people come from? The Bela Kun revolutionaries of 1919. So you've had this in every society, and we had it in China. I don't know that much about China compared to Europe, but you had an adversarial intelligentsia group there. You've had it. It's a universal phenomenon. So that's how I'd answer that.
I think the difference between Britain and America now is much less than you suggest. We have in Britain an identical principle of nationhood, of nationality. That is, that it is legally determined, it's not racially or linguistically determined, as I think is still, for example, the case in Germany. That it is simply a fact of either being born there or process of naturalization. Secondly, of course, the scale of immigration in Britain in the last decades, which is described rather wittily as the empire coming home, has altered things very substantially. And what I'd like to do is slightly to elaborate on the point that John was making about patriotic assimilation. Both of our societies have responded with this dreadful phenomenon called multiculturalism, which means that there is an enunciation of any dominant culture, and all cultures are seen free and equal. Can I just say that despite everything that I was saying about human difference and whatever, I have absolutely no doubt whatever that my culture, without being too patriotic, my English culture is absolutely superior to everybody else's. And I can produce a litany of greats that knocks America into a cocked hat if I look at my history. On the other hand, what we then have to do, because we can no longer be monocultural, we've got to decide how we negotiate plurality whilst retaining unity. And I think we should start talking, which is actually the truth of America. Americans, on the whole, didn't simply assimilate, they became bicultural. So and the degree of biculturalism, it varies from group to group and varies within groups. And what is striking about immigration in Britain is that all the successful immigrants are bicultural. I first experienced this when I was doing my performances on the Moral Maze, and I had a wonderful sparring relationship with Rabbi Hugo Grin, who on one occasion said, "Oh no, David, you're not half as nasty as you seem," to which I fluted back, "And you know, Hugo, you're not half as nice either." But it was a wonderful relationship, and he invited myself and my late partner to a Passover. I have never experienced anything like it. Here was a man moving on the public political debating stage in Britain and then becoming a high priest in his household. It was profoundly moving. And if we look at the Chinese, we look at particularly Hindu, I had a wonderful experience when I found myself in a country house after there'd been a wedding of a British man to a Hindu woman. They'd had 3 weddings. So they decided to have a registry office wedding in which they wore business attire. They had a church wedding in which she wore white and he wore tails. And then they had a Hindu ceremony in which they all got up in fantasticated gear. And you just saw this. Our look at Britain now. We're our Chancellor of the Exchequer, our Home Secretary. Compared with America, you're so far behind. And these are these are second generation immigrants.
Well, unfortunately, we have Kamala Harris.
Yeah, but it is genuine. It is seriously, it is genuinely astonishing. But all of these correspond to that bicultural variety. There are some immigrant groups, which it is probably tactful, as we are being recorded, not to name, that emphatically reject that.
Well,
and this is the problem.
Just a word on the bicultural, which we call hyphenated Americans. Yeah. That disappears after a while because people intermarry, and that's. And then after a while,
the Irish cherish a grievance against the British and keep it going from generation to generation. Look at the absurd performance of your president. I mean, on that issue. But there we are.
I think we have time for one more question. Jen?
Yes. Mario.
Thank you. One word I don't think I've heard this evening is aristocratic, as in the aristocratic tradition in political thought. And I wonder, of course, it might be implied or contained in what John Fonte said about the conception of the ancient world being one of those streams that feeds into the American political tradition. But I wonder if that aristocratic thought, if it does exist as a distinct strain and influence on American political thinking, if that is what helped to offset or mitigate some of the extreme excesses of liberalism that we inherited from the old world, and whether or not our move away from that aristocratic tradition in political thought, particularly through the 1960s, is what has contributed to the sorry state of affairs of today, where everything has gone to extremes.
Well, I'll just take a quick stab at this. Jefferson and Adams, of course, wrote many letters back and forth, and the only aristocracy they talked about was a natural aristocracy, an aristocracy of talent. I mean, they're both saying that so it was a meritocracy. I mean, that's what they aimed for, and they were both saying that this is because the American Revolution was essentially a rejection of a inherited aristocracy, but they did favor what the term was natural aristocracy, an aristocracy of talents where the people can rise. I mean, that was the idea. But as far as inherited aristocracy, no, I think there was a rejection of that.
But surely what happens in America is you get the emergence of plutocracies, of extraordinary political dynasties, and so on, manifestly the case. Look at hereditary presidents, in a fashion that would do credit to any banana republic. Except real elections did intervene. I think you've got a fundamental point. I think in both of our countries, we don't use the word aristocracy. If we use a slightly different word, America had something like a clear political class. We had a clear political class. Those classes committed suicide. And in Britain, we've never really recovered from the loss of the gentry class. Which again, I think characterized a lot of America because it comes from the same source, that sense of inherited obligation, that sense of public service, that sense that wealth has a public duty, all of these things. And much of that simply committed suicide in the 60s and beyond. And I don't think, and particularly because of the unwritten nature of the English Constitution, we've never really recovered from that. The substitution of mere party appointees throughout local government and involuntary society and whatever has been disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. I presented a deliberately sort of heightened picture of continuity. I mean, we've seen massive ruptures. What I would have to argue for are processes of, to an extent, reconstruction, as is manifestly taking place here now, literally and physically. One seeing what's going on in this astonishing reconstruction of the city. Societies do have moments when they have to be reconstructed. You have a period of reconstruction. One of the ways we will have to fight woke is a conscious looking back as to what has made, and we can both talk about it legitimately, our countries great, and to try to revive it. It can be done. Disraeli began with Young England. Disraeli began as a reviver, curiously enough, on an idea of the relationship between the aristocracy and the people, excluding the liberal middle class.
I think I'm going to ask a final, slightly pessimistic question. The natural aristocracy, which you're referring to, John, in America, and you were saying the same thing, David, has actually become part of the woke movement today. And
Has gone woke.
Yes. Now, and this seems to me to be a key point, because you're both historians. Looking back over the sweep of history, we can see occasions when leaders have come forward and attempted to arrest the decline. I'm thinking, in the Roman Republic, the General Sulla, who had a conservative regime. But have any of those conservative resistance movements actually won out in the long run?
Well, it's at this point it's ongoing. I mean, so we don't know yet. I mean, the resistance to this latest, to the woke revolution in the United States. I mean, the beginning of the resistance was from a very strange man, and we know who he was, the Orange Man, as he's sometimes called. He sort of said no on certain things. I mean, in a non-strategic way. So he totally triggered the the woke revolutionaries, they didn't quite know how to handle it. Now, the next, whether there'll be somebody in the future who does it perhaps in a more sophisticated way, it looks like I think it's going to happen. So I'm more optimistic.
Well, one society that did it rather successfully was Britain in the first half of the 20th century, particularly extraordinary figures like the backroom chap who invents. We began by having little jokes about pendant orders of chivalry and CBEs and whatever, and the man who was fundamental in all of this and reinvented the British monarchy in the first part of the 20th century is a man called going completely out of my head. Is a man called Viscount Esher, and Viscount Esher is consciously aware of the decline of the aristocracy. He's consciously aware of the French Revolution. His surname is Brett. He's half French, and the extraordinary success of the reinvention of the British monarchy at a time of the disintegration of the great imperial monarchies of continental Europe is one of the most interesting examples of a kind of countercultural movement, and one with why doesn't Britain experience communism or doesn't experience fascism? A central part of that, I've given the story of that broadening reform tradition, but it is a reinvention of the role of the monarchy, what we joke about as the House of Windsor of 1917 is the invention of this unique thing, a genuinely democratic monarchy. Extraordinary. Extraordinary.
I suppose de Gaulle would be sort of an example, though it didn't last either, and Reagan to an extent, but they didn't last. It didn't last. Yeah, right. Right. So there was some restoration there.
And I suppose it's true that if you wait long enough, nothing lasts. So,
yeah. The obvious example of the British Restoration of 1660.
Yeah.
You actually throw back the woke horrors of Puritanism. Genuine. How stupid of us. Yes, we do. That's a good note.
It's a very good note to end on. And a good note to follow that is to thank both David and John for an absolutely stimulating discussion which covered enormously important questions, but did so in a consistently interesting and entertaining and indeed gripping way. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed.